Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the power of data, mastering the language of the digital era. We're running this webinar on the back of a report that some of you may have come across that we published in conjunction with PALO IT. It was our view generally that we do a lot of work in the digital transformation space. We work with a lot of fintechs and financial services organizations in particular at Q&A. But we started to understand many companies were failing on their digital transformation efforts because they didn't have a good grasp of the topic of data. And data is, after all, the language of digital. And unless you really get your head around this, then most of the projects that you're going to run will flop. So we hope you enjoy today's presentation. The objective is to really run through some of the core content of the report. Hopefully the insights will prove useful because it's not designed to be an advertorial. It's very much from a practitioner's perspective, given we operate and advise in this space. And hopefully many of the concepts and ideas that we run through today are things that you can utilize and implement in the operations of your own companies as well. So with that in mind, let me just do a very quick introduction about the speakers today. We are going to be represented by the Q&A consulting team as well as PALO IT. Just on the Quinlan Associates side, I'm the CEO and managing partner of Q&A. I'm also the chairman of the FinTech Association of Hong Kong. I will be joined today by Justin Chung, who's one of my associates, as well as Charles Yao, a senior consultant in the team. On the PALO side, Jing, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, definitely. Hello, everyone. I'm Jing, Managing Director of the PALO IT Hong Kong offices. We are an international innovation and technology consultancy. Myself, I've been working in business consultancy for more than 10 years. And also I'm celebrating my 10th year here in Hong Kong. Today, I'm joyfully joined by our data lead, John, who is a main source of drafting this white paper in association with Quinlan Associates. So let's get into the topics and get started.
Wonderful. Okay, so we just want to kind of set the scene before we dive into the meat of a lot of how to run data projects and really where the pitfalls are. That's the emphasis of today's webinar. Really, where's the industry going? How are companies running their projects? Where are the common mishaps? And fundamentally, how to get things right. So let's just set the scene in terms of why data is important to businesses. The fact is data-driven organizations are a lot more likely, the data suggests 19 times more likely to generate profitability and 6 times more likely to retain their clients. You can see on the left-hand side a quick description of Amazon. It's a company that many of us know in terms of how we engage with it. A lot of use of customer data. So they're tracking our historical data. They're looking at our engagement metrics when we go and shop on the site, item-based collaborative filtering engines. So basically they're able to determine what are we interested in looking at and putting forward the right recommendations in front of us. So we're spending our time on the Amazon site with a higher likelihood to actually purchase something. And data-driven sales really sits at the heart of what they do. You can see customers making purchases based on their own interest, about 2/3 of customers, or recommendation of products by the data-driven algorithm is about 1/4. 1/3 of the sales that are going through the Amazon pipe. If we move on to looking at the global IT expenditure, there's no question about it, particularly in light of COVID, that companies around the world are doubling down on the IT spend. If there's one thing that's happened, many of us as consumers have migrated online. Our purchases, shopping, ordering food, ordering goods and services, things that we wouldn't have traditionally done in the past have largely become the norm. And recognizing this, many firms have adapted their business models to really work out how to capture that greater share of the online digital market. And you can see that's translating into direct spend figures. In 2020, about $475 billion was spent on data-related IT expenditure, and we expect that to grow by about 8% per annum from the 2014 period up to 2024 to hit just shy of about 630 billion US dollars. So no small amount. But the important part is dark data. So you're spending all this money, but there's a huge amount of information that companies are sitting on that's unknown or untapped. And you can see here on the left-hand side, based on that global spending, outside of the cybersecurity space and scrapping things that aren't relevant to this size, the amount of usable and dark data, you can see here, the dark data component is actually the majority of the information spend here. Dark data, we estimate, costed companies worldwide almost 200 billion in 2020 alone. And why is this data being unused? You can see that a lot of companies don't have the relevant tools. There's incomplete or missing information. There's information overload, which I'm sure many of us can attest to, as well as problems around accessibility to information. So all of this contributing to what is effectively dark data, information that companies cannot utilize. Now, moving on, when we look at why does this matter, it really boils down to recovery costs. Because if you look at this two donut chart, you can see based on the figures we're putting together, about 45% of all data collected by companies is actually used, which technically means the majority of it is not used. So there is an immediate waste in terms of information. But the important thing is, even for the information that is collected and used, it doesn't meet the right quality standards. How often have we worked in an organization and said, I don't trust the information. Can I get a check? Can we reconcile? There's manual errors. There's a lot of things going on with that. In fact, a big study run by Harvard Business Review found about 97% of data use does not meet those quality standards. So in effect, about 44% of all the data is imperfect, requiring processing. And processing time means basically you need to extract it, clean it, analyze it, produce it in an intuitive way, then visualize it. It takes a lot of time. And if any of us have had the responsibility to do that, we know it's not a pleasant task. The actual calculation is about a 10x factor of the resources need to fix imperfect data. So when you're looking at that as a cost, imperfect data representing 44% of all the data out there, a direct loss of 153 billion wasted as per the previous slide. But when you throw in the multiplier to fix this, the total cost to companies worldwide approaches about $1.5 trillion US. So a very sizable problem that many companies don't see as a direct number on their P&L, but something they obviously need to fix. So recovery costs, if we break it down in terms of why or how companies use data, you can see very quickly on the left, and I'll cover it on the next slide. Really, companies look at using data for optimizing costs, optimizing latency, so reducing time to receive the information, as well as revenue generation, both inorganically and organically. And if we break that down across those components in terms of inorganic revenues generation, cost optimization, and latency optimization, you can see just how much money is being wasted by organizations across the world in these particular areas. We move on to the next slide just to break down those business goals in a bit more detail. So again, cost optimization. A lot of companies may have internal goals to reduce headcount, expenses. They're looking at data day in and day out to do this. CFOs and finance teams constantly scanning their P&L, and a lot of sales teams or product heads may be instructed to pull cost out. But where are you going to do it? So a primary goal. Latency optimization, again, it's very important to get timely data. In this day and age, time to see information, time to act will often provide you with a competitive edge over the rest of the players in the market. And if you look at any particular industry, even things like financial services, trading world, need to be fast, need to be quick. And then finally, inorganic and organic revenue generation. Basically, how do you leverage this information to generate new ideas, find new customers, target new clients, and even sell the information that you sit on? And a lot of companies are starting to realize that data is not just something that they can utilize to enhance their own operations, but people will actually pay for it. So what's important when you look at the wastage problem, there's three overall dimensions that firms really need to consider when they decide what level of data investment is necessary. So how fast do they have to make the decision, right? Secondly, how accurate does that decision need to be? Does it need to be directional, or does it need to actually be pinpoint accurate? And then thirdly is really the volume of decisions. So how much data needs to be collected per decision made, and how many data points are needed to actually come to that decision. These three dimensions really frame the thought process in going into working out how much data investment is needed. So that's a little bit of context around the introduction. And now we'll move into a bit of color around data strategy overview. So important things to note in terms of basically looking at an end-to-end data project layout. Data strategy overview, you really need to start with what the project considerations are. So a couple of key things. What's the impact to the business of that project? What are the resources that are required to get it done? What's the time that's going to be needed? And the infrastructure requirements, particularly how salvageable are your legacy or existing systems in terms of building out a new technology solution or data program. Once you've done that, you can then classify that project into different types. Is it strategic? Is it a large-scale project that will steer the entire business or company? Is it tactical? Is it aiming to fulfill one of the larger strategic goals? Or is it operational? Is it just looking to optimize an existing process? And based on that, you would follow your relevant project approach. And that's built around what we classify as a BAIT framework, which I'll go into on the next slide. So important project considerations across the BAIT, as well as an overarching change management strategy. And both of these are absolutely critical in ensuring that data projects come to fruition and actually move the needle for an organization. So BAIT framework. So let's go through the idea of this project applicability, right? So the size and scope of the project, as we outline, determines how much of the BAIT framework and change management strategy are applicable. So let's just break down those letters again. BAIT is really the business objectives and limitations that will shape the future steps of the project. Applications, as you then need to translate those business requirements and convert them into, well, what are the technical specifications? Information is really the design of the schematics on data models, quality, and platform designs. And then you move into technology, which really comes last. This enables all the previous stages requirements through the use of relevant technology solutions. And this is where most people have it back to front. Finally, really, the change management strategy is very important in making sure this comes to life. And then the two most important elements to get this right are culture. There's huge amounts of organizational resistance, particularly with larger firms, to moving these change programs through, particularly because they require a change in behavior. And then governance is really the communication strategy, as well as the champions and oversight for ensuring these projects move forward. So important in this, just to clarify, is what we call the BAIT dependencies, right? The technology stage really is where the IT specialists design and build the optimized tech infrastructure. So that's really where the developers come in. But that supports all the prior stages within budgetary and operational limitations. And you can see here that we've got in dark blue line the dependency flow, and then in the gray line, the enablement flow. It's really the business strategy. That's where it has to start. Everything starts with the business. They define the budget, they define the objectives, and all the dependencies moving through the application, information, and technology. Technology is really the last stage of the process. And I can't stress how many times we have worked with firms that look to technology first and get it completely wrong and fail over and over and over and waste significant amounts of money trying to digitalize their business and make the best use of their data. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over now to Jing, just to set the tone for a case study that will bring to life how we will walk through the rest of this particular presentation. And hopefully all of this will tie back and make sense as to what this initial framework is. So over to you, Jing.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for a nice introduction. So we have experienced work with multiple diverse industry and with different project contexts. But for today's webinar, as we are all, each of us, a retail customer, we are taking a business case in retail. So it's an ongoing project. We have been working with a global luxury retail brands. And I'm laying out three quite obvious challenges that is also in common, not limited in the retail sector. So first of all, we are facing, and the client is facing, a changing customer pattern. So client is going to the digital first experience, and data is somehow a basic requirement to make this thing work. And second is about the data silos. As Ben mentioned, there are a lot of dark data today in the organization. And data silo means the highly segmented data that is with different database in different places, say the POS, the CRMs, the business unit. And then in different markets, different countries, different regions, these information are tracked and stored and used and categorized very differently. And in particular, in the luxury and retail industry, they put extreme attention to the ultimate customer experience, and it also get this information even much more complicated to tackle compared to the mass retail market, say a toothpaste. So at this moment, like 2 years ago, this is still okay. The luxury brand was not in a rush to change how they are selling and consuming the products. For the Gen Z, they have a very targeted campaign to tackle those clients. And then it's 2020, the COVID hits, everything needs to be accelerated. So that was at that time they came to consultancy like Quinlan Associates and us, PALO IT, to let us help them tackle these challenges. So let me pass quickly to Charles and take a deep dive into how the data strategy and the data framework could apply in this specific use case.
Thanks, Jing. Just a very quick note for everyone. With Q&A, we're going to leave time at the end to answer all questions. Apologies, I didn't dress this up front, but we'll leave time at the end to go through all questions when they come through. Thank you. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Jing. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be handling the debate process proper. And of course, as Ben mentioned, we'll be starting with business. Now, how do you approach a data strategy project? Of course, you have to remember that business strategy is at the core of everything. We have something called the ABC framework to help you dive down and narrow your scope just to get into a clear direction of exactly how your data strategy project is supposed to work. You start with your ambitions, aim high. If you have high level objectives for the company, you want to grow revenue, you want to build out your company's direction, a new business model, that's part of your ambitions. Of course, you have to consider the bylaws as well. Are there certain legal consequences for the actions that you'll be taking? A lot of the attendees that we have today operate on multinational companies or on a global scale. Where is your data housed? Is there something that's going to stop you from operating in one market versus the other and impeding your scale? And of course, finally, cost. If you had unlimited resources, then of course, the world is your oyster. But in this particular case, we also have to understand exactly what your limitations are and then scale and project the data project around those limitations. Next step would be understanding what kind of data domains are affected by your objectives. Now, the CIOs and CTOs in the webinar understand exactly what I'm talking about, but for everybody else, your data domains is essentially where your data functions, your data domains is where your functions and business meet together in terms of technology. At the end of the day, you run a business. You have, as you can see from the diagram on the left, you have finance at the center of everything, splitting out into customer, employee data, product data, so on and so forth. Because at the end of the day, you run a business, you need to understand what everything in your company is doing, how is it generating revenue for you, what's the return on investment. An example would be customer data. It could be anything ranging from sales data, online presence, their complaints, their loyalty information, marketing, and of course, their sales history with you. And that's how you go from secondary domains like sales data, marketing data, up to primary domains and customer, and then up finally to finance, just so that you can understand how data is working for you. And then, of course, we have a state analysis, which is comprised of 4 main components. Of course, there's something called purpose. You need to understand what you're using your data for. Are you trying to process and visualize it so that the owners within your business understand exactly what your customers need? And what about data frequency and technology stack? That is how often you need to collect data. How often do you need to process it? And of course, what stack are you using? Because that affects exactly how you interface with your technology. And of course, finally, your data owner and stakeholders. So your stakeholders could be anyone, let's say within a finance department that needs to understand how marketing campaigns are doing. But of course, marketing could be part of the customer domain. And that is, of course, owned by a customer data owner, someone within your organization who you can point to say, hey, this is exactly where you find something, and I know how it fits within the overall organization. Of course, you have your gap analysis, where you understand, once you understand where you want to be and where you are now, then you analyze your company from a technology and talent perspective. Do you have the critical functions necessary in technology to be able to scale to the aspirations that you have? And of course, technology is only one side of the coin. If you don't have enough people to manage that technology in terms of talent, then the whole thing falls apart. So this is where you conduct a gap analysis. And then in summary, at the end of the business process, you would have an overarching business strategy. You'd have a list of data domains that work within your business. You'd have a set of requirements that you need to fulfill, your current and future state, roles and responsibility, and of course, a list of capability gaps that you have, whether talent or technological, that would be identified that would impede possible implementation and then usage. Coming back to the case that Jing had on a global luxury retail company, in the case of a brand manager, brand managers in retail firms live and die by customer feedback and market trends. They need to understand exactly what their customers are looking for at a real, and as much as possible in a real-time basis. Whoever can do that will be able to quickly pivot and construct brand new products. And it's not just applicable to retail, it can be applicable to any other industry that you are working in. Moving on to the application portion of BAIT. This is where specialists translate business objectives, gaps, and requirements into functional requirements. This is where you start to blend business and technology together. In the case of our brand manager, let's just say the business requirement is brand managers want to see real-time consumer data and market trends on, let's say, a very simple visual dashboard and analytics engine that you have. Now, when you translate that into functional requirements, of course, that means you need filtered functional data, financial data. You need to understand exactly all the domains that operate there relating to customers. Then you need real-time processing. You need to be able to push data to a visualization engine. And of course, then you need to have intuitive visualization so that a brand manager, which is predominantly a business user and not a technical user, understands exactly what they're looking at and how to use it. And then finally, you map it to the application, which in this case, there's your basic CRMs, ERPs, your data lakes, and then your business intelligence engines, which are all, of course, connected via an API layer. Of course, then a little bit on the business side, you want to understand, well, okay, if I have this dashboard, how do I build it? Do I want to build it? Can I perhaps buy an off-the-shelf solution? And in this particular case, you would do a buy-build consideration. You would try to understand the criteria from 5 perspectives. Can you afford it? How flexible is it to your needs? Can you personalize it to, let's say, what a brand manager needs or a business manager needs? Finally, of course, if you're a global company, which many of you are, can you scale it? And finally, how fast can I get this done? In terms of development, there are 2 things. If you were to decide to build, let's say, a visualization engine in-house, you would create an MVP and you would determine, let's say, your value proposition of this application. You would map perhaps a user flow of how a business user would use it. And then, of course, you prioritize the core functions. In, let's say, a dashboard, the most core function would be able to pull data from disparate different parts of the organization and actually consolidate it. That's a pretty important function. Otherwise, you can't visualize any data that you don't have. Finally, of course, there is the build, explore, review, repeat, and then the launch cycle. Someone like Jung would be able, who's a data lead, would be able to talk about this in a little bit more granularity.
Yes, so definitely for data projects, because the nature of the applications that are used in data, is normally involving very diverse stakeholders with very diverse operations and use cases. So having a feedback from end user or internal users from an early stage, having an iterative approach to actually meet the priorities and requirements is crucial in terms of basically securing the success of the adoption of these applications. Normally, a lot of firms try to buy the solutions first based on the budgeting cycle, and then force the teams to implement, and then have faced a lot of failures around it. And that's why we are proposing these kind of iterative approach before we launch and integrate, to basically make sure that we minimize the impact or a risk of failure in terms of these kind of application implementation process. That's all for the technical input. Charles?
Thanks, Jung. So just to highlight to everybody, if you would have done the business and beginning application process of the BAIT framework correctly, a majority of steps 1 to 3 would have already been covered. The only thing that's happening at this particular stage is you're trying to build out something that actually your users within your organizations would use. How many of you bought a expensive, let's say, CRM tool and nobody decided to populate it with all of your customer data? That's horrific, and that's a horrible waste of your money. So this development process is very important. And in summary, for application, you would have been able to convert your business requirements into functional requirements, and then finally applications. You would have a list of applications and a potential integration timeline so that technical leads will be able to take it away and work within those constraints. Of course, you would have a list of technical capabilities that need to be fulfilled in terms of each application and each underlying dependency. In terms of our global luxury retail case, we have a dashboard, we have our applications, and of course, we map it to our capabilities. Now, some of the technical capabilities that come with, let's say, a real-time dashboard would be the ability to ad hoc query upon like a data lake, which consolidates all of your information in one place. Then you want the events processing, and then finally, you need high reliability of data validation. Now, what does that mean for a technical lead? Now, I'll have Jung talk about the information stage from here on out. Thanks, Jung.
Sorry about that, Charles. I'm having a little bit of problem with the mic.
No problem.
Just a moment. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right. So information, so we have discussed all the business requirements, the context, and how we break down it into functional requirements. And as Ben also mentioned about the overall requirement and enablement flow, information layer basically deals with how we support all those business functionalities and requirements by providing the relevant information that are used to make decisions inside business operations. But normally, the key metrics used to measure the data maturity is very crucial in terms of defining the information strategy, because as we come into the information, data, and technology layer, it starts becoming a little bit unclear for business stakeholders who doesn't have a technical background. So normally, a lot of companies approach data projects in terms of the variety of data, but actually we're proposing to use the data quality metrics, which will evolve and develop as the data maturity goes up inside the organization, and it will help us actually more accurately measure the ROI of data projects moving forward. So 5 pillars of data quality, that 5 pillars of the data quality will be associated to the availability of it. So it should be available whenever we need it. Usability basically is the data is correct and usable in terms of everybody's business needs. Integrity and consistency, just to make sure the data is correct whenever we want and wherever we want. And then, of course, the security of the data, which protects the information of valuable information of the company. So when we talk about maturity, we have actually defined different stages of data maturity just to make sure people are, it is easier for us to understand where your company or your business is at. So the 5 stages are just based on how how data is recognized in terms of strategic asset inside the company, and basically the basic infrastructure to support all those operations. So a lot of companies are staying in aware and reactive stage where they basically recognize data as an asset, and they are using a certain degree of it as a reporting format to respond to business situations. But then there are also industry leaders and exceptional IT firms that are on the higher stage where they are actually using data to proactively respond to events even before they happen, or create an autonomous system to actually respond on behalf of the company. So all these key activities listed in the table are the activities that helps you set a baseline to go to the next stage. And there are different areas of expertise and requires a lot of collaboration between business and technology, and essentially the putting information at the core of these collaboration is a key to communication, because the information itself is a shared language between the business and technology, instead of us just focusing on which technology, what kind of requirements, what kind of strategies, where the two parties basically cannot communicate anymore. And a lot of companies face this issues when they try to tackle a very large scale IT projects that involves information or other initiatives. In terms of the way the business data flow, is basically just a very quick demonstration of how data will change organizations on how they make decisions. So this is a very quick example of how data that you already have, because most of the companies, or actually all the companies, will have a certain degree of ERP applications, a purchasing platform, and financing applications, and all the data is generated through the business operation and saved inside the database of these applications. But then oftentimes these basically data is siloed in their places. We don't try to associate them together and try to operate all the business operations, making decisions based on these data, because there's not enough trust. So we're also just showing how simple and how straightforward it can be to just pull those data. They're sitting in your applications, make better decisions, informed decisions based on data, and then also those decisions can be tracked and plugged back into the applications to basically continuously improve your organization's decision powers. So overall, in the information layer, it might seem a little bit vague, but there are some key activities like modeling, cataloging, also designing or planning for the data platform, which is a basic computing infrastructure to help you create data-driven decisions, and then also planning for organization-wide data training so that the employees are used to, or not any more resistant to making decisions based on data. So if we plug it back to the sample case study, we talked about the brand managers basically requiring a certain level of customer intelligence or market intelligence based on the data systems. And then basically by having all these kind of information stage outcomes fulfilled, we can actually start thinking about setting up culture of trusted data. So all these business stakeholders or business users who are not even technically enabled can still use data, trust them to make decisions. And at the same time, basically data itself will be fed back into the technology infrastructure, which basically automatically ensures and enforces quality and also compliance, especially because we're dealing with client information. Also, the hot topic of these days is the disruptive innovation related to AI, machine learning, IoT. All these kind of innovation is possible when you have a sound information, basically visibility in terms of information architecture, and also the clearly aligned strategic vision on how to use this to basically enable more business opportunities. So if we move on to the technology layer, so basically technology, as Ben also mentioned, it's just about selecting the right tools in the right layer with right information and right responsibilities to support everything that came before the technology, information, application, business strategies. So this is just a map that shows basically the landscape of all the technical components that are normally associated with building the data platforms. All these layers, application integration, all these layers are basically categories of these components, just making sure it is easier to segregate the responsibilities. In the end, it will help us simplify the IT operation strategy around the data platforms. And then next is basically one of the things that we often overlook is the most important part, especially after the COVID pandemic, of the data and information. So we normally measure the security, cybersecurity or any data security in terms of three metrics: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And there are 4 core security services that goes into the security layer of data platform, which protects the entire platform, just managing identity, encryption, load balancing, and also a clear guideline on how to manage incidents and events and how to correctly parse this information. So as a summary, there are 3 things that happens in the technology. Basically, we talked about the map, which is the data platform architecture, and then list of procurement decisions is basically what and how, and the components inside the architecture, basically, what are we selecting? Are we using a data lake? Are we using a data warehouse? All these kind of decisions will be defined by the previous stages, application and information requirements. And then basically out of all these, for the technology layer, people, the IT leaders will be thinking about the integration of all these systems so that the data will flow naturally and freely within these platforms. And then the sample case study talks about the same thing, basically selecting the adequate technologies and seamless execution of dashboard by having a full integration of the systems fulfilled by the technology designs. So now all these complex components will need to be handled by a robust change management strategies, which Ben will introduce us with. Ben?
All right, sounds like we're moving from technical to fluffy, but I can assure you that fluffy has as much impact as technical. If you don't get your change management strategies right, all the investment, all the good work that you do in the previous stages will fall to pieces. So change management strategy is really important in the sense that there are 3 primary parameters that have to be addressed. Firstly is communication strategy. People need to be aware. A lot of that has to really come from what we call both a top-down and bottom-up perspective. And I'll run through each of these in a bit more detail. Secondly is really the framework, right? So that's documenting the data governance frameworks, how people are supposed to interact. And it helps managers and people who are data stewards and owners really control and implement the right kind of standards within an organization. And then finally is incentives. So that's making sure that people have the correct incentives to maintain certain behaviors. Without the incentives, behavioral change is often very difficult to enforce. And at its basic core, incentives involve a carrot and a stick. And organizations can use different methods of both, but I can tell you right now, even things like how you interact with or manage your own data, it's very rarely embedded in employee KPIs. And even if they are embedded in employee KPIs, they tend to be input-based KPIs, not output-based. As a result of that, you get a ton of garbage in, garbage out. That's why the bottom up is also very important, because as this message, the governance, everything cascades from the board to managers to employees. It's really employees who face this day in, day out. They can identify the issues to escalate. They know what the problems are. And that channel of communication really has to go back up. Because if the BOD, who's so far removed from the coalface, is maybe getting some of this wrong, they need to know. So it's very important for that communication to be cyclical and ever evolving, a very dynamic process that is basically governed by what we would call an agile governance framework. The next part is really change management strategy. Again, so the 4 components of what we call a cultural governance framework: communication strategy, actionable frameworks, incentive schemes, and agile governance. I won't go through all of these in a huge amount of detail here, but again, you can read all of this in the report, but it's very important. Comms is right. Actionable frameworks, again, making sure that the goals and KPIs are there, the incentive schemes coming in to drive those behaviors, and agile governance, ensuring adaptability, especially in this day and age where things are changing all the time. And in terms of the stakeholders that needs to apply to, anywhere from the BOD to ExCo to managers, all the way to employees. So don't get mistaken that this is just something that needs to apply to a certain level. An entire organization needs to be incentivized and changed in the right way for the people to actually move forward and execute on these new initiatives and make data really come to life in an organization. I have seen it so many times in my career where organizations haven't got this sorted out. It's a complete flop. And it's part of what I want to address in some of the Q&A coming through, especially that first question. But all right, so that's change management. Don't forget about it. Very, very critical.
I think I kind of remember at one of the banks that I worked, as soon as the CEO announced that this is going to happen and this is the different performance incentives, people were literally raising their hands and saying like, I want to be part of this scheme. So as soon as those type of tone on the top is made, then people will really want to drive this change. Without that right tone, it's really hard to implement at the operational level. So just want to share that testimony that I have from my own experience.
Completely agree.
Next, we'll pass over to Jing, who will finish up the wrap up the case study. Thanks, Jing.
No problem. Thank you, Charles. So jumping in, just looking back to our business case about this global luxury retail brand, just to recap the context that we have mentioned. First of all, is the change of customer behavior that they are going to the digital first. And second challenge is about the data silos, which is creating the misalignment of the data management. And the third, dealing with also quite sensitive personal data because it's the privileged customers. It's a key security point that we will need to pay attention to. And last but not least, the long history of this long-lasting brand also bring in legacy system, which needs to be tackled with the new onboarding application system after year 2000, alongside with those who are from the 90s. So moving on, just a quick slide to show how the context has been breaking down into different actionables. So we use the BAIT model to break down the content into 3 actionables. And with the end goal on the right side to achieve this end result ecosystem on the right side, you can see in the middle of everything, it's quite popular today, the one-stop application, sometimes also known as the super app, which is backed up with a robust information system and the data system on the IT side, and also enabling the different day-to-day operations, client-facing, internal, etc., and all covered with encrypted protection on the security layers. And for us, we step in, first of all, set up the alignment committees with the board of directors, lay out the high-level data strategy. And with them, we very fast would set up the priority to tackle and also do a quick feasibility assessment on the legal side and also the technical side to make sure what could be done in the reasonable budget and time frame. And then we will quickly step in on the design and build side, and having in mind that we never want to start everything at a big scale from scratch. We always try to tackle and leverage what the existing resource and system as much as available in order to create a fully integrated data system to support their day-to-day activities. And then the third steps, which is an ongoing journey, is that technology is a tool that we all know it won't work without people. As Ben mentioned, while we are communicating the strategy, or we are doing the actual day-to-day work, it's not only important to let people know how to make use of those, but the why. So it's also a part that we will be tackling on the people and the process, make sure everything would be aligned. So it's a lot of work and it's still an ongoing process, but we have already seen some tremendous outcomes with shorter time to market thanks to a faster decision-making cycle with the available data. And so at the end, not only we optimize the operations, but also have a direct impact on the revenue generation with all this data-related work that has been refined. So we have here at the end of our presentation, and maybe I'll hand it up to Ben to tell a bit more about how we can help around this.
All right, a bit of a shameless plug here, but generally, if you're looking at who our organizations are, we both operate in this space, particularly working with anywhere from mid-sized to multinational corporations on their end-to-end data strategy, build, implementation. The reason why we partnered is Q&A and PALO IT focus on different ends of the spectrum. With us as a firm, it's really around developing strategies, particularly with respect to how to best utilized data. I've had plenty of companies in my time, anywhere from stock exchanges saying, how do we launch our market data proposition, who our customers are, what should we focus on, to banks basically saying, how do we better utilize our CRM tools, right? Literally broader strategic questions. The overall preparation with that, as well as looking at the overall business solution design, governance, culture, regulation overlays, and then training and enabling the staff to really drive your new data strategy within the company. That's at its core. And again, to stress from the outset, you cannot do these projects without solving the business component first. If you get that wrong, there's no use to the entire BAIT framework. It all starts with a B. But on the rest of the stages, I'll let Jing really go through and talk a little bit about PALO.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I will quick, quite high level with PALO IT. We founded in 2009. Some might not heard about us, but we started as a hardcore agile software development company. And nowadays we are in 7 countries with our 11 offices and 500 collaborators. We are an international innovation and technology consultancy. And we're pretty proud to be the first B Corp certified consultancy here in Hong Kong on the tech side, because we consider the impact to the community, environment, customer, employee in every project that we have been conducting in. And data in particular is a powerful tool as technology. We're very aware of how this might shift the behavior of the customers and also the employees, and over even at a social scale. So it's something that we will be embedding in our discovery design phase, and also while we are implementing the solution with our partners. And data is definitely one of our core offering and more demanding these days with our customers. And we provide an end-to-end offering at any stage of the maturity of our client stages, either for the technical assessment, building an application, or to review the overall technical governance. So it's pretty quick and brief, and let's keep more time for the Q&A. Here's the question and answer sessions as I hand it back to Ben.
Perfect. Okay, so this is just our contact details. We also have a link to the report that you can go and look at to read up on this particular paper. Please scan the QR code. This is part 2 of what we call the Real Lingua Franca, the real language business. And you can read part 1, but this is the one that we did in collaboration with PALO. There's a huge amount of content in there. It's nice for bedtime reading. Now, with that in mind, we'll go over to Q&A. And I think the first question that came through very early on in this presentation is, how can I tell if I even have dark data? What are the telltale signs? Maybe I can start with that, and then the other panel participants can weigh in. Look, dark data, in my view, is something that many companies sit on. Some of the telltale signs, you don't have centralized systems. A lot of people basically isolating and ring fencing or siloing their own information on their own servers, on their own desktops. Lots of use of Excel. That's a telltale sign, as well as companies that tend to have what I would call pure input-based KPIs. So many companies collect data, ask staff to do stuff for the sake of doing stuff. I often wonder why people do it. I'll give you a very tangible example. Work with a bank. All the relationship managers at the bank have an input-based KPI. You need to log 20 core reports per month. That is the requirement for the data input into the CRM system. There are no other KPIs or parameters around this data. What do you get? You get free text. You don't get drop downs or standardization around what is put in. You get all the data coming in at the end of the month to meet the month target. So 29th, 30th, 31st, because that's the KPI. It's for the month. So there's no real-time dissemination of information. And by the time people see it, it's useless if they even do see it. So many people see it as a box ticking exercise. It's a bit more tedious. They don't utilize it, and companies are collecting this information. They're storing it. They're paying data storage costs. People are wasting their time on a lot of these things that don't actually tie back to the performance of the organization. So something to really bear in mind. This happens so much. How do you know telltale signs? If you know that your bosses, your organization at its core is collecting data for the sake of it, and you wonder how this links back to a particular action, outcome, or responsibility of a person, if that link is not there, then often it doesn't make any sense. And as as an ex-banker, part of executive committees and all that, I used to sit there month in, month out, and have finance put a 100-page PowerPoint deck out of just page after page of P&L. And I would think this is the biggest, most useless waste of time in the world. From an executive committee perspective, what decision am I supposed to make? What is the insight from this analysis where I can actually do something with it? And that was a huge challenge. And that's why we use this example of a dashboard, because it's just something so basic that so many people in a company may want to see. And obviously it needs to be customized for different reasons. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has anything else to add around the dark data point.
Not at the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope that addressed the question. We have another question coming in. How do you think a company that owns its entire own value chain from production to retail could leverage data for better strategic insights? So maybe to share it around with the PALO team, because this ties back a little bit more to the example of a retailer. So maybe if they own the production line, you know, and then the logistics and freight and everything right through to the retail store, why don't you share some of your insights on this?
So I think if it's the value chain solely owned by the business, then we will have different operations that might be generating data or might be storing data that looks a little bit different. So normally we will have an ERP software in the middle just to do the forecasting and predictions. But then we have outpost applications like POS, CRM. How are all these applications basically dispatched into different layers of supply chain as well? And then having all these data to be interconnected to each other. Well, interconnected to each other to make an insight is the first thing. So we actually laid it out in information and application stage where we were talking about the full integration of the systems. And then often for full value chain companies like this, their main challenge is basically the different types of applications and data silos basically unintentionally created during the business growth stage or expansion stage. And then basically having a single body or single initiative in basically we talked about in the change management strategy to have a streamlined data view, and then basically having a very streamlined understanding of the data domains on how to understand business entities associated to the full value chain or full operation chain of the business will allow us to basically have a view on how to integrate these systems into the domains. And then basically we look at things in a high level saying, so we're looking at these kind of numbers in terms of our customers. We're looking at these kind of numbers in terms of our production. We have these kind of numbers in terms of the finances. And then we basically have a high level connection between the domains. And then we basically make sure the information and technology layer follows along with these kind of insights. So basically what I mean by it, if I put it in a nutshell, is the full value chain looks very long, but then it's basically composed of different components. We just have to make sure we have a single body to connect all those information by having a single view in terms of the domains. And then basically having that together will give you a strategic insight in terms of the data flowing all the way from the start of your value chain to the end of the value chain. And that's the job of our information architects or technology architects to do. And then normally these kind of experiences come in retail or any other production related companies that have a very long value chain and very long supply chain as well. So
I think one of the things I've maybe it's not quite applicable to the person who have raised the question, but in terms of banks, for example, one of the biggest challenges that banks face is, according to my experiences, each department kind of owns their own data, and then they don't want to disclose it to other departments. They feel like as if those assets are not being, it belongs to them and they shouldn't be disclosing it. But then the reality is those type of mindsets and those type of, how do I say, defensive mechanism around their own data assets must be disclosed and must be open source, connected through an API in order to generate more meaningful insight throughout the entire organization. So bringing that type of mindset change would be very critical in order for the companies to really leverage the data to its full potential.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, just on that, you bearing in mind compliance restrictions and other things associated with banks sharing information department to department. But there are a lot of areas where that's not necessarily the case. My last 2 years when I was working at UBS, I was responsible for integrated bank delivery, which is the whole cross-business collaboration point. And to just go on the point of change management, it's very easy to come up with ideas about where new pockets of revenue are, where a private bank can open up its client base to, let's say, an investment bank to go and work for one of these wealthy individuals to do their IPO. But then what does the private banker want? Why do I give it to the IB? I want money. And usually, if you look at how this all comes together, I spent so much of my time creating the right incentive structures for departments to refer deals and business to each other. They would often do it on different arrangements, like a transfer pricing model. It could be a direct transfer, it could be a shadow accounting arrangement where they basically double book and then have a good fight at the end of a year as to who contributed what. But incentives, and to go back to change management, really, really important. But on the point of value chain, maybe just one more idea, because we spend so much of our time in fintech. And if you look at the world of fintech, you're starting to see a lot of consumer fintech apps recognize the value of owning that data value chain. So the e-commerce companies, guess who needs to plug in? Payments, right? That's the gateway to actually receive money. But not all people can pay because they don't have the cash. So guess what? Buy now, pay later, right? So there's a credit facility in there. For example, you saw Square acquire Afterpay to form that part of the value chain. You saw PayPal acquire Paydi in Japan to form exactly that part of the value chain. The number one company that really owns the entire thing right through to fulfillment is Amazon. And we can see that in terms of, yeah, shop in our store, but we'll deliver to you, we'll package, we'll do all of that, and we'll get it out to your door. It's very beneficial to understand how that all works, because once you own the data value chain, you can basically feed that information as insight into every single step of the customer journey to optimize that end-to-end process.
Yeah, I think customer journey is one side. On the other side, there is a great strength owning the whole value chain and the whole data. Talking about the retail industry, and we are more and more looking into the ESG side, the impact side of these companies. And in Europe, for example, there is a law and regulation that require the company to be compliant from the end-to-end processes. So the traceability that this data might be able to enable for your company on these topics would be super valuable to have an end-to-end traceability of order from raw material to the product and also lead to the end customers. It's also a possibility of preventing, for example, the risk for the sourcing stages until the final product that is released. So I guess there are a lot that can be done around these topics. So happy to take this topic also off today's webinars and forward further discussion.
Wonderful. Another question that's come through. At what stage of a company's growth does it need to start thinking about its data strategy? Okay, maybe I'll pass this to Charles.
Sure. So that's a really excellent question. And the honest answer to this is that it should be considered at every point of your growth. Now, this could be applicable to anyone as large as a multinational firm that is, let's say you're in a retail space, or let's say you're a bank and you operate on a global scale. Can you say for sure that you have done all the key activities that would create an optimal environment for data to be able to steer your business? In one of the slides that we talked about the various maturity stages of a business. Now, a maturity stage doesn't apply to the size of a company. You'll notice that if we share the slide right here, it completely doesn't mention anything with regards to the size of a business, because anyone who is as large as, let's say, a Facebook, or let's say a JP Morgan or a Louis Vuitton, you could be anywhere on this maturity stage. Now, I've mentioned a lot of big names. At the same time, you could be a tiny startup company with just 4 employees, and you could be very, very high in terms of the maturity stages because you thought from the very beginning, okay, instead of using Excel to keep all of my data siloed away, keeping it down to limited to 1 employee, I'm going to think about how my data within my business that I generate, whether from my customers, my supply chain, or whether internally, how does that contribute to the overall business cycle that I have? Can it be used to steer my business in the future? And what systems are in place to ensure that it is all aligned? If we were to take you through the maturity stages, let's say that you are within an early, let's say SME, you're about, let's say, approaching 100 employees, and you build, let's say, a SaaS model. You have a SaaS system, you're helping insurance companies build out their insurance platforms. Great, awesome. But you haven't really thought, or you haven't trained your company or your employees to think about, okay, how can I use insurance data to create better products for my customers, my insurance companies that need, what do they need at the end of the day? You won't be able to see exactly what they need unless you have properly created an integrated platform that, let's say, plugs and plays data from insurance companies right into your system to understand exactly where they should play, how you should play, and exactly how you can help them grow their business and yours at the same time. You can't do that if you're sitting, with your data siloed with your BD team, your sales team, your product team, and your HR team, all separate from one another, and you can't talk together as a whole integrated system. So in a roundabout way, at what stage of a company's growth should you start thinking about data strategy? The answer simply is every stage, from day one, if possible.
Yep, I completely agree from day one. Like, if you just visualize this pyramid, let me just put it in a very simple analogy. At what stage should you start thinking about basically designing your house? So no one goes in and then says, I got a brick here. Here's a bedroom. Oh, I realize I need to put a table in. And that's what happens with so many companies. Your data is the foundation of every single thing that you do going forward. If you haven't mastered, and that's why we called this report the Real Lingua Franca. It ties absolutely everything together. So it's very important to get the foundations right, because when you get the foundations right, you can build on it. It's stable, it's scalable, it will return value. It's when you do it so late in your cycle or maturity as a company that change management aspect becomes even more pronounced. And then all the resistance to doing things another way, or looking at information, storing it, typing things in another way, that all goes back to a square one. And a lot of companies can struggle with that transition. So I completely agree. Day one, right? Any company, think about what's relevant to you. And as Charles said, some of these things may not apply. It depends on the type of business that you operate in, the industry you operate in. It's different for every single firm. Now, look, with that in mind, we have hit our 1 hour end of target for the webinar. And we're out of questions. We appreciate those questions. They're very good. We hope you found the session interesting. Again, I've been in, and many of the team here, as well as the PALO team, lots of webinars, lots of discussions, lots of views. We wanted to make this a proper practitioner view, right? Really getting to the heart of what we see as people in the industry and how companies should be thinking about it without overlaying all the fluff and nice story. Hopefully you found it interesting, and it's something that you can take away to your own companies. And as mentioned, we both have our contact details on the latter slides, which you can refer to once again. If you want to reach out and discuss your data strategy, your data needs, please come reach out to the joint Q&A and PALO IT team, and we're happy to come and discuss this together with you. Okay. All right, so on that note, a big thank you to all the panelists from Q&A and PALO today. Thank you, Jing, Jung, Charles, and Justin, and appreciate everyone joining. Again, have a good evening, and we look forward to hearing from you and to hopefully working with you in coming months and years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.